Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this final session of the 50th anniversary of Greece's existence. My name is Pavle Levi. I'm a professor of film studies and art history and a former director of Greece, I guess last former director of Greece for now, which is to say my mandate preceded Professor Weiner's. I have a pleasure of chairing this panel, and which is called Evolutions in the Field, emphasis, I would say, on evolutions as an ongoing process. So as we are to hear from our three speakers, process that has been affecting Greece, of course, but that will continue to affect it inevitably, always for the better. So I will introduce each of the three speakers right before they take their turn. And the first is Robert Cruz, who is a historian whose research and teaching interests focus on Afghanistan, Central and South Asia, Russia, Islam, and global history. Professor Cruz is the author of Afghan Modern, The History of Global Nation. It came out in 2015. And For Prophet and Tsar, Islam and Empire in Russia and Central Asia from 2006. Professor Cruz is also co-editor of Under the Drones, Modern Lives in Afghanistan, Pakistan Borderlands, and another co-edited volume, The Taliban and the Crisis of Afghanistan. Professor Cruz's work has also appeared in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and the New York Times. He served as director of Greece from 2010 to 2013. The title, do we have the title here? Yes, The Politics of Eurasian Studies, from Greece with 2 E's to Greece with 3 E's.
Thank you, Pablo. Thank you very much. Actually, English University furnished me with the title. I don't actually know how Greece got its extra E. I wasn't here, so I'll rely on others, my elders. Oh, good, very good. Thank you. Yeah, that predated me, so it's a bit of a bait and switch for you. My apologies. But thank you, Owen. Thank you for having me, for giving the opportunity to reflect a bit on the course of Eurasian Studies. The first thing I'll say, perhaps the most important thing, perhaps my only contribution to say that Eurasian Studies has a branding problem. So if you know from my very cursory internet research leading up to this talk, I found that there is, of course, a Eurasia Express Cafe across the space. There are grand schemes for United with railroads and airplanes. There's a kind of far-right Eurasianist vision of Russian nationalism with a creepy symbol someone can help us with that is really reflective of the far-right of Russian politics, imagining Russia at the center. And then you have all kinds of corporations call themselves Eurasia something or other, right? So unfortunately, when Pablo and Gabriel and others, Norman, all former directors, when you spill out the long title of the center, people stumble over the Eurasia part and they never quite know what it is, right? So that's one of the dilemmas I like to address. What is Eurasia? What does it mean? What it signifies is not entirely clear. And there are two key problems here. First is the ambiguity that's geography, which lends it to be a cafe, I think a Japanese, European-style restaurant, whatever that means, or it can be a grand scheme for kind of unifying different world regions. So we have the problem of ambiguity in our subject matter. The other issue is that its elasticity has made it particularly vulnerable to political pressures, as we'll see from Washington, from Moscow, from elsewhere, especially at the moment, the political conjuncture in which it was born, really as a kind of modern field in the early 1990s. That was a moment when, as we'll see, as I'll try to show, the political moment really led to the particular shape, which is directed the course of its evolution to the present. So those of you know, I see some nods from people who know the broader history, of course. One of the points of confusion about the terminology is that it's closely associated with the intellectual movement, often known under the heading of Eurasianism, a movement of Russian intellectuals who, once they left Russia following the revolution, ended up in places like Paris and Berlin and so on. And so the language here, I'd like to quote briefly one kind of representation of what Eurasia might be in the words of a figure named Peter Savitsky, who in 1933 highlighted what he called the linking and unifying role of Middle Earth. You'll know Middle Earth from Lord of the Rings, right? But here it means something more distinctive. So here's what he argues that Middle Earth is all about. He argues that the nature of the Russian world as a central world of the old mainland is being quite clearly revealed, begins 1933. There were moments when it seemed that emptiness lay between the periphery of Western Europe, so-called European Russia, of the old geographers, to which the Russian lands before the Urals belonged, and Asia, China, India, and Iran. The Eurasianist arrangement of Russian modernity is filling this void with living, breathing life. Since the end of the 19th century, the direct path from Europe to China and Japan has been laid through Russia. Here, Great Siberia is a useful road. Geography points out with absolute certainty that there is no other way to run roads from Europe to Persia, India, and Indochina. Even today, such opportunities have not yet been fully realized. The Trans-Persian Railway, cutting through Persia from the direction of the northwest towards the southeast, and connected the same route network as British India and Europe through the Caucasus, Crimea, and Ukraine, was close to fruition on the eve of the World War. Currently, however, due to political circumstances, it has receded into the realm of groundless projects. There is no connection between the railways of Russian Turkestan, that is the Central Asian republics, and India, and Russian railway networks are not oriented towards the Europe-India transit movement. But sooner or later, this movement will become a fact, whether in the form of railway paths, automobile lines, or air traffic. For the latter, the shortest distances are, let us say, of especially large importance for Russia. The greater the weight that will be procured by air traffic, with its propensity and desire to fly in straight lines, the clearer will be the role of Russia-Eurasia as the middle world. The establishment of transpolar lines can still further enhance this role. In the far north, Russia is a neighbor of America in a gigantic space. With the opening of a path through the pole, or rather over the pole, Russia will become the connecting link between Asia and North America. So if you're following Russian politics today, there are many echoes of these geographic imaginations present today. And you know, those of you following Putin's politics, figures like Anton Dugin are kind of the inheritors of this very similar kind of Eurasianist thinking, which has become quite influential in Russian imperial circles, or national circles today. But some of the echoes from the 1930s, again, have reappeared to animate the imaginations of Russian nationalists at the center of this so-called Middle Earth today. Of course, Kreis did not envision that particular scenario when Kreis got its E, Gabriella, and Nancy could probably say more about this. It was born in a different moment, but again, the confusion, the kind of overlapping language provides for some uncertainty about what the politics of the study of Eurasia is all about. So, as I understand it, in the early 1990s, Kreis got its E, it's got its Eurasia, along with lots of other area study centers in the United States. And here there was a very clear, I think, political mandate in taking on this new geography. The mandate was to understand in 1991, the breakup of the Soviet Union, to understand the landscape transformed by the emergence of 15 new states, right, to understand where they came from, to look back to the Russian Empire. This is part of my job as part of a cohort of students who went through PhD programs in the 90s. Animated the idea that we would understand the empire. Some would study nationalities. Some would engage in kind of building on the Hoover series that was mentioned this morning on nationalities, try to understand the landscape that emerged in 1991. That was very much part of what was driving. I think you try to explain the present by looking back to the past. So many of the scholars who worked on this field, especially in the area of nationalities, highlighted the kind of constructed nature of nationality. It was a moment when people had been reading Benedict Anderson and others who looked to understand nationalism as a kind of project that was about identity construction. But more broadly, and here I hope others will say more, looking at it from the point of view of Washington, I think part of the agenda was somewhat different. The agenda in Washington really was to really lend legitimacy to the sovereignty of these new nation states. I think more broadly, when one looks at the, especially Russian policy under Bill Clinton, the overall kind of strategy was to work toward the containment of Moscow, to prevent the kind of reformulation of the Russian Empire, which was a central anxiety at the time. And in scholarly circles, if you recall, for example, Roman Shkorlik's famous formula about Russia and Ukraine forming an empire, right? The notion that Ukraine was central to Russia's imperial identity. Without Ukraine, with an independent Ukraine, Russia would exist as a less less of a threat global stage, right? So this kind of nexus of Ukraine and Russia being central to Russian empire building, I think had a particular influence among policymakers who wanted to ensure, I think, by advancing the study of the various 15 republics, that in some way Russia could be contained, right? And that the new states would gain legitimacy by having scholars like me and others go and work in those settings, and then create a kind of useful history of national sovereignty for them. And really a project that swept across Eurasia. So Ukraine, I think, was pivotal for this, to establish a study that Ukraine has its own national history, its own legitimate project of sovereignty. But it was looked somewhat different in different regions. So the Baltics, I think, was more of an understanding of the Baltic states finally, quote unquote, returning to Europe as part of a natural process. But in the Caucasus and Central Asia, it was much more about, I think, imagining independent states that would deny Russian access to oil and gas markets, freeing them up for Western consumption. So you recall the story of the 1990s very much about pipelines and very much about integrating the Caucasus and Central Asia into new capitalist spaces. With Chechnya being an important kind of limit on this scheme because Washington took care to ensure that Moscow had free reign in that part of the Caucasus to ensure that Chechnya would not be the 16th new kind of state. So in short, this is an understanding of Eurasia, a kind of political framing of Eurasia that reflected Washington's consensus about what the new post-Cold War order should look like. Right? I think many of us were asked to contribute to that project of advancing the sovereignty of these new states. In terms of the scholarship of that period, there was lots of interesting stuff. It's quite important. I think some imagine now as a kind of golden age. That's a point that we might debate because I think in hindsight now the politics of the moment are somewhat clear that we were also somehow swept up in a particular moment which was really about geopolitics at some fundamental level. Even though lots of good work was done, I think we will read that work differently in the future. So to look to our next very important moment that shifted the politics of the field, I would highlight the centrality of 9/11, the way in which the 9/11 attacks really led to a reconfiguration of how Washington, at least, imagines this region, with a real accent on securitizing Islam, that is, seeing Islam and Muslim peoples as a security challenge, such that through a kind of lens of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, the Pentagon's imagination of the space took priority, and now we have much of Eurasia being hyphened off as part of a central command, which, as you see from this map here in color, Central Asia now becomes part of a kind of greater Middle East, including Pakistan, Afghanistan, and space all the way through to Egypt, which is a major shift, I think, in how Washington began to think about this space. It no longer was just post-Soviet, it's now kind of an arc of instability. It was about Islam, it was about security, and it was about counterterrorism. Another key moment to appear just a few years later that might attract our attention is the phenomenon of the so-called color revolutions, which I think further securitized the American lens on the region. So we have Georgia, actually the Rose Revolution in 2003, the Ukrainian Orange Revolution in 2004, Kyrgyzstan, the Tulip Revolution in 2005, all of which in different ways culminated in an Arab Spring in 2010 and 2011. Of course, these events followed on American wars of regime change in Afghanistan and Iraq, which I think again shifted much of our analysis to try to understand and actually politicized through a kind of very American lens the politics of these political contests in the Caucasus and Central Asia and elsewhere. Certainly actors in the region, and particularly in Moscow, saw these political contests very much through the lens of regime change, right? This idea that what had begun in Afghanistan might end in Tbilisi, in Tashkent, or even indeed Moscow. So part of the story here, I think, is that with this kind of central command vision, because this is a Pentagon map, this is the area of responsibility map showing essentially a segment of the Pentagon that was meant to develop expertise and logistical control over the space. Simultaneously, the much diminished State Department moved some years later to a very different view of the region, which is quite important for us. There is this moment of what I might call incoherence in American foreign policy, when the Pentagon and State Department begin to see the region in different ways, in different spatial relationships. So here we have Central Asia now being kind of hyphened off into South Asia, right? In a way that doesn't have the same security kind of focus, but which shifts this territory further away from our former kind of post-Soviet focus. So Central Asia joins South Asia, but importantly, the Caucasus remains part of Europe. Right? So if we go back to this map, the Caucasus remains part of this broader European space, in the imagination of Washington at least. So what is the effect in scholarly terms? That's more difficult to say. We have another situationist here who could say more about this. But as I read the development of the field, intellectually, these pressures do play a role in shaping priorities, certainly funding, the opportunities. One effect of the so-called color revolutions is that many of these countries now become much less accessible. So my Uzbekistan project flamed out when Karimov kicked a bunch of people out, right? So many of us shifted our research priorities given just logistics, right? That once the Soros Foundation was gone and once other American institutions were gone, these places became more difficult to work in. So that's one kind of constraint. So, and one can also argue that the State Department in particular lost interest, right? As the oil and gas kind of urgency seemed to recede, and as the United States became more of a producer, more energy independent, this all had the effect of shifting, and as those states did not go along with the American war effort in Afghanistan, I think attention further drifted away from, especially Central Asia, and even from Caucasus, which had an effect on funding and opportunities. But I also point to forces within the field, among historians, among political scientists and others, who engaged in a kind of internal gatekeeping, which I would argue has contributed to the continued marginalization of the scholarly study of Eurasia as a kind of field, right? So it remains, it's got its meetings, it's got its conferences, it's got a book series or two, but very rarely is it actually integrated into disciplinary conversations about politics, history, sociology, or anthropology. So this is a kind of enduring dilemma. I'm not sure what lies at the root of this, except to say that for some scholars who conceive of it as a kind of Orientalist, in the kind of neutral sense, discipline, there's a very, meaning one that has a kind of philological orientation, there's a very high bar for entry, right? So over the years, Greece has done important work to advance language training, to get people studying Kazakh and Uzbek and so on, but without a really deep philological foundation, in the eyes of many of the kind of authorities in the field, it's very hard to enter this, which is, I think, kind of part of its marginalization. More broadly, in our kind of humanistic disciplines, the Eurasian problem remains somewhat marginal, right? It's not really part of, I would identify as the kind of mainstream curriculum, except at a few universities where you have Central Asians who can do this stuff and actually make it a priority. So its continued marginality is partly a function of external politics and pressures, and partly, I think, the nature of the field. It's actually been kind of gatekeeping, which is resisted, I think, its inclusion. So at Stanford, probably we'll recall a very interesting meeting in which, just before you took over, I was meant to go and defend the Greece master's program. And I did so, and I faced a guy whose name I don't remember, he's an economist, who asked me, if I remember the language probably, why retain an area studies organization that looks like it was created by Stalin? So naturally, I was not so pleased to hear that. Probably didn't know what he was walking into. But I tried to make a defense, arguing that in fact, Greece's formulation of its kind of geographic imagination of the region as a course of study has actually worked quite well. It's actually, I think, is one of the strengths of the program in that the kind of persistence of that lens, sticking to it, has been quite important for reasons that I'll point to in just a minute as I conclude. But I would add, though, Eurasia as it exists in Greece's formulation is still a very productive lens, but I would go further to say that, especially if one wants to understand Russian politics, looking at Eurasia Plus is also, I think, an exciting agenda, meaning looking beyond Eurasia into the Middle East, into South and East Asia, and into really a realm of politics where I think Russia has particular priorities today. So I want to conclude with a few images. Really just part of my work now is looking at contemporary Islam in Russia, or Islam in Russia for the last 20 or 30 years. And it's really striking just in the last few weeks and thinking about this talk, the attention that the Kremlin is paying toward presenting Russia as a Muslim power, to presenting its Muslim populations as part of a global ummah, a global community through which Russia can exert influence into former Soviet states, naturally, in Caucasus and Asia, but beyond that, into places like Syria, Iran, and even parts of East and West Africa. So this is one interesting quote that kind of summed up all of the recent diplomatic contacts between Russia, its Muslim officials, and foreign Muslim states. This has been especially important in Crimea. If many of you followed that, the whole quandary entry of the Crimean Tatars, Russian Muslim clerics in particular have been asked to play such a role in making this whole process go more smoothly by getting Crimean Tatar Muslims on the side of the criminal. If you know, if you're following Syrian politics, you know that working closely with Turkey and Iran to attempt to establish its influence there. In the former Soviet Union, Islam, this is from the site of the main Muslim political authority in Moscow. Really, he is meant to be a kind of extension of foreign ministry to really activate ties to former Soviet states. Of course, Kazakhstan and Tajikistan are featured here. Moscow is also meant to be a kind of place to really, that increasingly is presented as a kind of center of Islam throughout the space. So Islam is imagined as the glue that will hold Eurasia together in this formulation. So you're going to have to have a senior figure in Tajikistan who's brought to Moscow to really establish his authority under the guardianship of Moscow and its authorities. Right? So it's a long way of saying that there's a lot that holds the Crease area together, right? Despite what our friend who said, excuse me, being us being Stalinists, there is just looking at the subfield of Islam alone, there are ample reasons to consider this all together. But more broadly, for those of you studying economics and politics and so on, one of the features of the last few decades since 1991 has been an astounding increase in mobility across Eurasia. So labor migration is absolutely central to understanding all the economies of this space, right? So if you've been to any major city in Russia in the last few years, there's a dense presence of everyone from the Caucasus, really everyone from Central Asia. And indeed, the Russian economy, its dynamism, Russia's investment in playing a role as a kind of security player throughout the space. And then I would also argue the dynamism of Russian as a kind of global language and culture are part of the story that is also part of the glue knitting this space together. So I'll just highlight a few economic factors just briefly. Remittances, if you deal with these abbreviations, are quite substantive, but I think another image is more striking to see actually how important these are. This is a good figure for the total remittances just to Central Asia. But if you look at how crucial this is as a percentage of GDP for many states, you know that Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan alone rank among the top 10 most states that are most dependent on foreign remittances. These are all remittances, of course, from construction sites and markets and various commercial spaces in Russia itself. So all this is likely to persist, so that our subject of Eurasia, configured as Greece, has managed it over the last 50 years, or last, actually, I don't know how many years ago, plus when they got tea, right, will remain quite important. And Russia as Middle Earth is likely to, I think, persist as a force in the lives throughout this space, right? So I think our challenge is to kind of detach this project from the Eurasian nationalist one, right? Detach it from the fast food restaurants and actually lend it some substance in terms of an area of study actually rooted in disciplines. So I will pause there and look forward to any thoughts you have about the challenge of branding Eurasia more convincingly. So, thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Not the least for recalling that unpleasant memory.
You're welcome.
I thought I successfully repressed it, but
No. Sorry.
I actually felt at that point, I completely puzzled by that question. I felt like saying, but I only think our curriculum is not Stalinist enough. But I knew that would be misunderstood completely, and we had a rigorous MA program to defend. So I said, what do you mean? And they didn't know.
It's a good answer.
Our next speaker is Gabriela Safran. She is Eva Chernov-Loki Professor in Jewish Studies, Slavic Languages and Literatures, and the CREASE Director from 2007 to 2010. Gabriela has written on Russian, Polish, Yiddish, and French literatures and cultures. She is the author of Wandering Soul, the book's creator, S. Ansky, from 2010, a biography on early 20th century Russian Yiddish writer who was also an ethnographer, a revolutionary, and a wartime relief worker. Gabriela is now working on 2 monograph projects, one on how people in the Russian Empire listened across social lines, recorded and imitated others' voices in various media, and reflected on listening and vocal imitation, a topic on which she has recently published numerous peer-reviewed articles, and the other on the international prehistory of the Jewish joke. Professor Safran teaches and writes on Russian literature, Yiddish literature, folklore, and folkloristics. The title of Gabriela's talk is Reforming the Alphabet, Reforming the MA Program.
Hey. Not just the blur. There. Okay. So I'm really happy to have been invited to reflect here a little bit on my time as the director of CREASE and what's happened to CREASE in the period that I've known it. I was actually director not really for 3 years, from 2007 to 2010, but only for 2 years because I was on leave for a year, and John Dunlop sort of sat in as director during that time. So I'm Nancy Coleman did such a wonderful job thanking everybody, but that's one more person that we could thank for his service to CREASE. I took office in 2007, which was right after we officially made the change, adding the extra E for Eurasia. And so during my time at CREASE, we thought a little bit about that change and what it meant, and also we spent some time reworking the MA program. So I'll talk a little bit about the MA program because that's something people haven't talked about so much yet. And I'll spend a lot of my time today actually highlighting one student's paper as a kind of stand-in for all of the great MA papers that have been written at CREASE. So Bob has talked about the shift towards studying Eurasia from a more substantive perspective. I experienced it in 2007 from a kind of formal perspective. We were adding the E. It looked funny. Having 3 E's in a row, it looked like a typo. I remember joking a lot that we should actually add another E for Estonian studies, and then it would really look like we meant it with all these E's. I also remember there was a bit of joking about how we were adding this extra E in 2007, so it was sort of 16 or 17 years after all of those successor states to the Soviet Union had come into existence. So the kind of historic change that we were recognizing with our addition of the E was the age of our incoming freshmen. It was sort of about time. But I think we all understood that adding the E was a formal thing, and we were going to have to really work on figuring out what that meant for us as an institution, as a group of people. So I'll sort of bring that up in talking about the MA program. So our MA program is wonderful. We always compete for students with the other Russian studies, Russian area studies, MA programs around the country. And during the time that I was in charge, we decided to figure out what we could do to become even more competitive than we had been. And we really started to study what made us different from other MA programs in the US in our area. So the 2 big differences that we noticed were that our program was just a 1-year program and almost all the others are 2-year programs. And the other big difference is that our program did not require any kind of a master's thesis, and a lot of the other programs did require a master's thesis. So sort of coming out of that, I recruited Mitchell Stevens from the School of Ed to do a study of our program and our students, and he and a grad student from the Ed School spent a long time talking to our current students and our alums and sort of figuring out what was happening with our MA program and how could we improve it. And what came out was a sense that the students really liked the 1-year length. They did not want it to be 2 years. But the students really wanted more cohesion and more of a sense of closure with the program. So we decided on 2 innovations, which we instituted in 2009. One was that we began to require the students to come to a weekly talk. So we had these weekly talks that were the same time and day every week. I believe it was Fridays at noon. And we would get either Stanford faculty or visitors to talk for an hour, and our MA students were required to come. And that meant that they had this weekly moment when they were all together in the same room. And the other thing we decided was that they would have to do some kind of capstone work. And we really did this in a kind of tentative, cautious way where we said, okay, your capstone is just that you're going to choose some paper that you wrote, any of your 3 quarters, and you're going to do a 10-minute presentation on it at the end of your 3rd quarter. So we'll have a day on one of those Fridays at noon when all our MA students will get together and they'll each give a little 10-minute talk. And what happened over the next sort of few directors, so under Bob and then Pavla and now Amir, is that those 2 changes that we made, the addition of the weekly talk that the students had to go to and the capstone, both got more and more serious and rigorous, right? So the weekly talk transformed into a class that all the students had to be in, and they would be in it, and it was for a grade. And I think that was amazing. You know, I've been working with CRE students, you know, not just when I was director, but since then. And I feel like that addition of that weekly class has really made them feel like they are a cohort. They know each other really well. They have this sense of kind of working together and watching each other learn as a group, not just as individuals. So that was one change that really got institutionalized. And the other change that got institutionalized is the capstone, which maybe suffered mission creep. It just got bigger and bigger. So it moved from being this 10-minute thing at the end of the 3rd quarter to a paper that they really work on quite seriously over much of their time during that 1 year. And often they produce these, 30 or 40 page papers, which are amazing and reflect original research, and which I think they can be really proud of. And so, because I've really been sort of fascinated by watching the process of the development of those 2 changes in the MA program, I want to spend the rest of my time talking about one of those capstones, one of those capstone projects that I happened to advise the year before last. So it was the capstone paper written by Amber Franklin. Who here remembers Amber Franklin? Yes? Okay. Yeah. So Amber came to the CREASE program from Chicago. She went to the University of Chicago. She got a BA in linguistics and Russian, and she had been taking Russian and also some Kazakh, and that was why she was attracted to Stanford, is because we are a place where you can do Central Asian studies in a serious way. And actually, as I was preparing this talk, I called Amber. So I can tell you, she's in DC, she's fine, and she remembers Stanford.
Is she employed, Gabrielle?
Is she what?
Is she employed?
She is employed. Well, she's employed, but she hopes to be more remuneratively employed soon. And she's actually, as with many of our new students, she's working in DC, and she's kind of thinking maybe she wants to come to a PhD program, and maybe Stanford would be a great place. So that's another of the things that are the effects of our MA program. So Andrew came to me and said, could you advise my capstone project on Kazakh alphabet reform? And I said, I know nothing about Kazakh, but I do know something about spelling reforms and alphabet reforms in general. I know something about linguistics. So I said, okay, So then over the course of this year, she wrote this paper, and it was totally fascinating. So this is what happened. This is what I learned from Amber in relation to Kazakh alphabet reform. So Kazakh alphabet reform is it's this thing that happened in 2017, 2018, where Kazakhstan really began seriously to move toward Latinization, right? To using our alphabet, the Latin alphabet. In order to understand this, I think you have to remember that alphabets tend to be borrowed. Very few languages have their own exclusive alphabet. English got its alphabet from Latin. Actually, before we used Latin, we used runes. The Old English used runes, which it also borrowed from some other Germanic tribe, but then they added extra letters to sort of fit some English sounds. And it's also important to remember that alphabets are arbitrary and conventional, so no alphabet fully transcribes the sounds that exist in a given language. There's always a kind of approximation and accepting of conventions. So Kazakh, where did it get its alphabet? What's the story of its alphabet? In the start of Kazakh writing was in the late 18th century, when the Russian imperial government, already moving towards Central Asia, sent Volga Tatars to, quote, civilize the Kazakhs, and the Tatars wrote their language in Arabic script. And so Kazakh began to be written in Arabic script by those people. At the same time, later, second half of the 19th century, Orthodox missionaries began creating a script for Kazakh that was based on Cyrillic, right, which they felt would facilitate conversion to Christianity. This didn't actually happen that much. The Kazakhs didn't convert very much, but this alphabet was out there. After the 1917 revolutions, the new Soviet authorities, so people in Moscow and also in Kazakhstan, wanted to do various things. They wanted to foster literacy and a strong Kazakh identity, and they cared a lot about writing systems. They were opposed to religion, so they wanted to cut the ties between the Kazakh language and the Arabic script, or the Kazakh language and Islam. So they wanted to eliminate the Arabic script. They also wanted to demonstrate that they were anti-colonialist. And so the new Soviet authorities wanted to show that they had nothing at all in common with the old Russian imperial government. And therefore, they didn't want to use the missionaries' Cyrillic alphabet for Kazakh. So after a decade or so of debates and discussions, they decided in 1929 to adopt the Latin alphabet for Kazakh. And the Latin alphabet seemed to them like a kind of good neutral vehicle for modernization, a good neutral vehicle for separating yourself from the Russian imperial legacy. This was a period, the late 20s, when Soviet language planners were really into the Latin alphabet. They were actually talking about shifting the Russian writing to Latin letters. Armenian, these languages that have very old alphabets. Soviet people in power fantasized that by using Latin letters, they could reject everything bad about the past, religion, colonialism, and embrace this new technological international future. But the Soviets didn't really put enough resources into implementing this plan. There were actually only a few hundred Latin typewriters that were assigned to Kazakhstan. So if you wanted to type in Kazakh, you had to use one of your old Cyrillic typewriters. So you were still typing in the Cyrillic alphabet, even if that was now not officially the alphabet for Kazakh. And even in 1929, not everybody was on board with this idea of using the Latin letters. Some people still wanted to use Cyrillic, and they were still using Cyrillic. And in 1940, they won out, that group won out, and Kazakh began to be officially written in an alphabet that's close to Cyrillic. So here it is. There's a table with that Kazakh alphabet. All right, that's 1940. Fast forward to 2017, contemporary Kazakhstan, or Kazakhstan of a couple of years ago. President Nursultan Nazarbayev wants to do a lot of things at the same time. He wants to maintain peace between the ethnic Kazakhs and the large ethnic Russian population. He wants to maintain good relations with Russia and also reach out to the rest of the world. He wants to demonstrate that his country is moving away from the past when it was dominated by Russia and Russians. He wants to foster a useful, kind of benign Kazakhstani nationalism. He wants to be technologically forward-looking and to demonstrate that he is. And so he cares a lot about the Kazakh language and supporting it. And in doing so, he makes an announcement in December 2012 that Kazakh is going to transition away from Cyrillic toward Latin letters. Again. And everyone's wondering, well, how will we do it exactly? What will we do with this Latin alphabet to adapt it for Kazakh? On October 26th, 2017, Nazarbayev signs a decree called "On the Translation of the Kazakh Alphabet from Cyrillic to Latin script," and there he revealed the version of the Latin alphabet that would be used. So here it is. What's distinctive about it, and what people totally hated, is the apostrophes. So look at all those letters with the ones in red, right? There's these new letters that they have these apostrophes after them to represent Kazakh sounds that are not usually represented by the Latin alphabet. People thought it made writing look terrible. They thought it made things take up way too much room. There was an outcry. Nazarbayev at first did not respond to this outcry. He was just like, that's the alphabet. Here's the alphabet. And so some people began to actually make the shift to this alphabet. Business owners, government offices, publishing houses began to transliterate signs, menus, other text documents into the new script, adding all those annoying apostrophes. But then on February 19th, 2018, Nazarbayev issued an amendment to his previous decree with a new version of the Latin alphabet for Kazakh. Here it is. Right? So those apostrophes have gone away, and instead we have accent marks, and there's an I without a dot, like you have in Turkish. It's very sudden. I've been meeting with Amber every week as she was working on her capstone paper, and she came in just like in despair. You know, she's like, I've been working on this, project with this, and suddenly it all changed. There's a new alphabet. All my research has gone down the tubes. But of course that wasn't true. Her research was still good, and this didn't prevent her from writing a good capstone paper. So as Amber was writing up her paper, I suggested that it would help her readers to kind of visualize these changes if she could choose one sentence and write it in the three different alphabets, the Cyrillic, the first Nazarbayev alphabet, and the second Nazarbayev alphabet. And she chose the sentence, "Unfortunately, my cat does not like the new refrigerator." So I can't pronounce this because I don't speak Kazakh, but here it is in these three alphabets. So in writing her thesis, her capstone, Amber became fascinated by the rhetoric around alphabet reforms, and especially by the parallels between the rhetoric around Latinization in the 1920s and 30s and the rhetoric around Latinization in the 21st century. She read a lot of sources from the 20s and 30s, and she very carefully analyzed contemporary Kazakh media, looking at both Russian and Kazakh language newspapers to understand how people were justifying Latinization. What she found was that the Latin alphabet has been used in Kazakhstan to symbolize very similar things in the 1920s and 30s as in 2017 and 2018. The Cyrillic alphabet, once associated with the Russian Empire and its missionaries, then became associated with the Soviet Union and its ideologies. The Latin alphabet, in contrast, is not associated with Russian control over the Kazakhs, and therefore it appears to be anti-imperialist, however strange that might seem to us. Also, the Latin alphabet, then as now, is associated with technology, and she found these really familiar kind of modern-seeming discourses from the 20s and 30s about the Latin alphabet being a way to get access into just using all sorts of new machines. Amber found another important parallel between the early Soviet period and the present. Since the choice of alphabet is always, in a way, arbitrary, since no alphabet can ever perfectly represent speech sounds, the decision to use one set of letters rather than another is fundamentally always symbolic. Of course, alphabet reform is a real change. And it is one that, at least initially, has very high costs. It has high costs just in terms of paying for new signs and books and whatever, and it has high human costs because alphabet reform, this kind of very serious alphabet reform, like Latinization, takes people who have been literate and it renders them functionally illiterate until the time when they adjust to the new alphabet, which they may not all do. At the same time, alphabet reform is a political move that sends a strong message about the loyalties and the aspirations of the state that implements the reform, and eventually the loyalties and the aspirations of the people who use the new alphabet. But given the high costs of these changes, the people who argue for them tend to try to kind of preserve deniability about the reasons behind them. They don't necessarily want to admit that they are imposing so much work and cost on a population for reasons that are fundamentally symbolic. And so in their rhetoric about alphabet reform, they stress logistical, practical reasons for making the changes, as though there really was a kind of powerful objective difference between alphabets, as though one were really so much better than the other. Okay, I've spent all this time telling you about Amber's thesis for two reasons. One is that I think it's a great piece of work. I learned a lot from it. I really enjoyed advising it, and I'm just happy to take the opportunity to share it with you. And thereby, in a sense, to just remind all of us, like, one of the reasons we're here is to kind of help students generate excellent research. And so I kind of want this to stand for all the excellent student research that's been generated because of CREASE, and to sort of make us think about that. I also think that Amber's work is a really great example of the shifts in the MA program. We at CREASE went through our own very small-scale alphabet reform when we added the extra E for Eurasia. And it was a little bit like Latinization #1 in Kazakhstan in that it looked funny. It looked like it might have been a typo. We also reformed our MA program and we added a capstone, and thus a decade later I got the pleasure of advising this excellent paper. For Kazakhstan, the results of the changes that they've undertaken in their writing system are not yet fully clear. For CREASE, though, the addition of the extra E for Eurasia, the broadening of our geographical purview, and the addition of the capstone are producing some effects that I think we can all applaud.
Thank you, Gabriela. Wonderful presentation on what is fundamentally the politics of language and how Monty Python-esque sometimes it gets. Next speaker is Mitchell Stevens, who is Associate Professor of Education and by courtesy of Sociology. Professor Stevens is Associate Professor of Education. He studied the organization of U.S. higher education, the quantification of academic performance, and alternative school forms. Most recently, he co-authored a volume called Seeing the World, How U.S. Universities Make Knowledge in a Global Era. Came out of Princeton in 2018. It's a study of how U.S. universities organize research and teaching about the rest of the world and the role that area studies play in this endeavor. Professor Stevens is also director of the Scandinavian Consortium for Organizational Research, a cooperative institution that has brought more than 500 scholars to Stanford over a quarter century and catalyzes organizational scholarship worldwide. Professor Stevens' talk today bears the title CREASE in Context, Past, Present, and Possible Futures of Title VI Centers in the U.S. Academy.
Thank you. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here today. I would have been here all day if it weren't for this darn job that obliged me to teach earlier in the morning and afternoon. Gabriella suggested that I begin my remarks by giving you a sense of how I got connected to CREASE. And I took her advice because I think the account is a good index of the alacrity and entrepreneurialism of this program. I arrived at Stanford in 2009. My previous appointment was at New York University. And I'll tell you a little bit about the project that I brought with me, which is represented by this image here on the screen. Gabriella had seen my name on a PowerPoint presentation at an anniversary conference for Title VI in Washington, and seen that my bio now said Stanford, and found me when I got here. It was 2009 or 2010, I can't remember which. And at that time, the Title VI office was pushing very hard on new forms of measurement and accountability for Title VI. I'm actually a student of measurement and accountability, and had brought with me a project on area studies, which I'll talk about again in a moment. Gabriella reached out to me, and we had a couple of coffees and talked about ways in which CREASE and some other Title VI centers might be assessed in ways that not only would please the federal government offices, but would actually be of value to the organizations here. And we designed a modestly scaled study, which was really focused on talking to people more than counting things. And Gabriella mentioned, some of the seeds that we collectively were able to plant in that work. Robert Wesling was the associate director at the time and was instrumental in that effort. Another finding that I remember vividly, and which resonated with many colleagues here, was for the school teachers who would participate in curriculum development workshops in the summertime, which have been a central part of Title VI's outreach mission for many years. And of course, there was a lot of presumption that the primary purpose of these programs was to change curriculum in high schools. To which our thought was, sure, yeah, maybe that's an important part of the outcome of these programs. But one of the things my students and I found when we interviewed the participants in the programs was the thing that most mattered to the instructors who participated was the fact that they could work collegially with other teachers and with Stanford faculty and sort of talk about substantive content rather than just pedagogy. They enjoyed the experience of having a professional, collegial, academic-based experience, right? Presumably the curriculum also diversified and improved, but certainly the teachers had other utilities that they got from the experience. It was also the case about this time the first Obama administration was investing more heavily in community colleges. And one of the things that came out of our discussions in that period was perhaps the mission, the outreach of CREASE and other Title VI centers here could be expanded to include community college faculty And instead of thinking about K through 12 outreach, thinking about K through 14 outreach. And again, the directors and associate directors of several Title VI centers took that idea and ran. And now programs for community college faculty are very fruitful, productive, routine parts of what happens here at CREASE and with other centers. So I have long chalked that up to part of the miracle of Stanford, that you can actually, something can come out of your mouth and or two or three people's mouths, and things actually happen here. But I hope to also suggest to you that phenomena like this are also functions of Title VI centers generally, and the special niche that they've been able to carve for themselves in the organizational ecology of U.S. Universities. So I'll give you just send a few lines about the empirical research on which that claim is based. This is work that was done jointly from the very beginning with Setaneh Shami, who is an anthropologist of the Caucasus, who has long been director of the Asia portfolio at the Social Science Research Council and is now the founding director of the Arab Council for Social Science in Beirut. And Cynthia Miller-Idris, who is a sociologist currently at American University, who studies right-wing extremism and nationalist movements in Germany and Western Europe. We were all in New York at the same time in the early 2000s, Setaneh at SSRC, Cynthia and I in neighboring offices in the Graduate School of Education at NYU. And in 2003, the U.S. Department of Education put out a call for proposals to investigate the range of social science disciplinary inquiry that is being supported by Title VI centers. They were specifically interested in the amount and kind of social science inquiry in political science, economics, and sociology, the so-called nomothetic social sciences, which claim universalistic ambitions. And word on the street was that it was no accident that that call had happened after 9/11, when there was anxiety across Washington about what Americans knew academically and strategically about the Islamic world. And what organizational infrastructure might be in place to build that capacity going forward. So echoes of Bob Cruz here, certainly. The RFP didn't say 9/11 on it, but it certainly was very clearly in the background. The Social Science Research Council, as many of you know, had been instrumental in the creation of area studies as we know it, and in fact, the project that we proposed to the Department of Education was the first funded research project that went directly to SSRC rather than to affiliate universities. And I know that because we had to create our own IRB protocol just to make sure that that program went through. But I think it's quite appropriate that SSRC did that work. And Cynthia Miller-Idris took the lead on design. And remember, I said that the primary ambition of the project, according to its call, was to assess how the disciplinary social sciences of economics, political science, and sociology sort of fit into the portfolios of Title VI centers. So we designed a qualitative comparative project in which we selected 8 US research universities that had at least one, but actually at least 2 Title VI centers that touched the Middle East, Asia, Eurasia, Central Asia, and South Asia. Again, the center of gravity for the Department of Education was the Islamic world. And we chose 8 universities that had at least 2 Title VI centers. And we sought to interview the chairs of the social science departments of economics, political science, and sociology on each of those campuses, the faculty directors of the Title VI centers on those campuses, the associate directors of the Title VI centers on those campuses, who, as we all know, do the lion's share of the work of the centers, and then also, if the campuses had them, the deans or provosts of international and global affairs. We also conducted focus groups on each of the campuses. And this all happened in weekly site visits and collected a bunch of data on the origins of these centers. So none of these campuses was Stanford. I also, what else? And it's so it was another opportunity for me with Gabriella's invitation was this would give me an opportunity to learn about Stanford's local landscape, though Stanford itself is not sort of implicated in this particular work. And the research yielded three main findings related to this question of what we called the ambivalent internationalism of disciplinary social scientists, by which I mean the modest extent to which discipline-identified economists, sociologists, and political scientists engage deeply in substantive research on regions outside North America and the larger Atlantic world. Those relatively few, the Andrew Walders and Jean Oys of the world notwithstanding, right? There are quite a few highly esteemed disciplinary social scientists who are regional expertise, but the vast majority of disciplinary social science that is produced in the United States is about North America and Northern Europe. Why is that? And I'm going to give the glass half full answers, 1 and 2, and then the glass half empty answers first, and then the glass half full to end on an appropriately optimistic note. Okay, but of course you always have to tell bad news if you're a sociologist. It's part of what we do. All right. So the main findings. One of the first things we found out was that it was for regional inquiry. It was really important to recognize that. Disciplinary departments are the highest status organizational units in the US academic world, right? The US academic world is a caste system. Tenure rank positions in the disciplinary departments is the Brahmin caste, right? And there's a lot of other academics and a lot of other academic work that gets done in universities. But a lot of it happens in what we call not departments. They're called institutes, centers, initiatives, projects on, and centers, right? In which a lot of teaching and research and administrative work and discourse like this happens. And a lot of it is well regarded. We're all perfectly legitimate. These units are perfectly legitimate members of the academy. But they are essentially always categorically subordinate to departments. And that's important for regional inquiry because regional inquiry is almost always housed in not departments, right? So disciplinary departments are organized around supposedly universalistic abstractions, anthropology, comparative literature, history, sociology, and not departments are what house particularistic inquiry. And this is a good thing in many ways for the expansion and fluidity of academic planning because you can have all sorts of different kinds of organizational units. But it was kind of always the case that those who had appointments in regionally defined not departments were kind of bumping into this status hierarchy. And of course, academics who are plotting their futures want to plot toward positions in departments rather than not departments. And faculty encourage their students to write dissertations headed toward toward departments rather than not departments as a sort of bet hedge against the always competitive job markets. And so this implies a sort of a deep reproductive tendency toward disciplinary abstractions in North American research rather than regional inquiry. The other big finding we had was the tension between numbers and languages. Getting good at these has a lot of startup costs. Getting good at these has a lot of startup costs. And students and faculty in the social sciences often regarded these startup costs as mutually exclusive, right? And so you thought, ceteris paribus, the social scientists say you should invest in these rather than investing in these, right? Which is great if your part of the world has good versions of these, right? But if you're studying a part of the world that has data that aren't up to snuff by North American disciplinary standards, you're sort of constantly at a disadvantage. And so this tension both between the startup costs of quantitative versus linguistic skills on the one hand, plus the relative paucity of of data sets that cut and muster in the social sciences the further away you get from the global north tended again to encourage people to invest in this side of the ledger rather than in the other. This also gets exacerbated by a sort of reciprocal sense of dissing that experts get. People who are really good at these don't like to be told that numbers don't tell the whole story. And people who get really good at these don't like to be told that these are irrelevant, right? And that this is the real data, right? And that tension is kind of always at play in the kind of academic work that we do. So, to end this, why is there so little social science on others the further away you get from the global north? 3 answers we suggested. Abstraction is privileged in the disciplinary structure of the US Academy, and its department and not department binary. Languages are hard, and numbers about regions further away from the global north are scarce. That's the glass half empty. What's the glass half full? I want to remind you of a story that you probably already know, the old folk tale of stone soup. Who knows the story of stone soup? Raise your hand if you've heard it before. Okay, yeah. This is a story about scaffolding collective action, right? They're journeymen moving from town to town, and they bring with them a big iron pot. They find a stone, they put the stone in the pot, they fill it with water, they light a fire underneath it, and they start acting as if they're cooking. And natives and local people come by and ask what's happening. So, oh, we're making stone soup, it's delicious, and it would be just a little better if we had a carrot. And it would be a little better if we had an onion. How about some garlic? Or you could just bring whatever you have. You got a ham hock, bring a ham hock, blah, 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 blah. And soon, right? And soon there's enough food not only to feed the travelers, but also a larger community of people. We got this metaphor actually from a quote from one of our center directors. And we were asking center directors, how Title VI centers work. And she said, we do a lot of co-sponsoring of things. Our center doesn't have a very big budget, and so virtually everything that we promote or initiate ourselves works on a sort of stone soup principle where we go to get multiple co-sponsorships. And this kind, I won't read this other one here, but you'll see, we saw this over and over again in our work. In fact, it's the first chapter of the book that we wrote. Essentially, that the very modest investment that the federal government made in Title VI centers gave a kind of, created an excuse for an organizational unit that had the imprimatur of the federal government, but did not provide enough resources for those centers to work on their own. So what center directors did was use the imprimatur of their center to build relationships with other units across campus. And in the process of building those relationships, again, with much alacrity and entrepreneurial spirit, right, creating new kinds of relationships, new kinds of instructional programs, new kinds of lines of research that wouldn't otherwise exist in the academy. And that, I think, is probably the most valuable lesson that this particular program might take into its future. One, to recognize the many accomplishments that have happened in this stone soup kind of way here at Stanford over the last 50 years, and to sort of proudly take that tradition and that practice and bring it into the future. So I'll just sum up. I want to suggest the way we concluded the book was to argue that Title VI centers can be thought of as intellectual and organizational lubricants. You don't need that much of them, but if you don't have them, right, the organization and its scholarly flows don't work nearly as smoothly, right? So they're modest in size and scale, but they are very important to the intellectual machinery of the universities they inhabit, and they have found their niche in this way, right? Title VI centers were not created to be intellectual and organizational lubricants. They were created as instruments of the Cold War, but they continue to endure in this lubricant function, I think. And so I guess our modest suggestion would be that in an always uncertain climate for government funding, developing a language for talking about this entrepreneurial alacrity might be a good way to preserve the position that units like this one have going forward. Thank you.